Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. Welcome back to the channel if you are a returning viewer, and if you're brand new, I would like to welcome you to the My New Microphone YouTube channel, where I talk a lot about music production and mixing, and today about mastering. So throughout my music career, quickly, I've done a lot of performing and recording on the artist side, and I've also done a lot of recording on the engineering side, a lot of mixing and composition, and a little bit of mastering, although it's not necessarily my strong suit. I still do it, and I like to master my own material that I produce and mix myself. So today I basically just want to run through a simple and effective mastering chain that I'm using for an upcoming album of mine. We'll focus on one track and go through the entire mastering process. And I will do my best to explain every process I'm using in the mastering stage to give you guys a better idea of how I go about mastering so that I can get that final polish on my mixes. So without further ado, let's hop into Logic Pro for a simple and effective mastering chain that you guys can check out. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to talk about mastering. In today's video, we will be mastering the song The Reservation. So this is one of my songs. The final mix is right here. You see the Reservation 2023 mix for mastering. And I will leave a link to this song once it is released in the description box down below. But before we get started, a few housekeeping details. In this video, I'm going to rely exclusively on my headphones. Normally, I would be switching between monitors and headphones just to get a better sense of what the master will sound like in different playback systems. But for the sake of feedback, I'm just going to use my headphones for this video training. And I want to stress before we get started the importance of, once we are done mastering, to bounce out and reference it on as many playback systems as possible. In this video training, for the sake of time, we are only going to go through this one time, but I would highly recommend, once you go through the mastering process, to bounce out your master, take it to the car, take it to your stereo system, take it to your earbuds for a walk, and just pay attention to how it sounds in a variety of different playback systems, because ultimately mastering is about maximizing the translatability of the mix. So again, we are only going to do a single pass through of the mastering process in this video, but after I'm done this, I will take it out to a variety of different playback systems and just make notes on what could be enhanced, and then come back to this session and make any tweaks if necessary. The other thing I want to mention about mastering is the utility of presets. So right here, I have my settings right here. In the case of Logic Pro, my preferred DAW, I can click on this and I have AF mastering, so Arthur Fox mastering. And if I was to click on that, it would automatically load up all of these plugins that I am using for this video and for all of my mastering. So I like this signal chain personally. You can use whatever signal chain you would like in your mastering, but if you'd like to follow along, this is what I'm using. I have the iZotope Ozone. This is a multi-effect mastering suite, and I've got a variety of different processes loaded up here. We will get to those in a second. I also like using a bit of soft clipping just to help get a bit more loudness out of the track. I use the StandardCLIP by Sir Audio Tools. Sometimes I like to use saturation. It depends on the master and how much saturation or distortion there is in the mix to begin with. This is a way to just help warm things up, to get a little bit more harmonic content, particularly to bring out some presence in the low-end instruments if they are lacking in the mix. And in many cases, it helps us to get a little bit more loudness. And then, of course, I cap it off with some limiting. I actually got these settings from a fellow YouTuber by the name of Streaky. I would highly recommend checking out his channel. I'll leave a link to that channel in the description box down below. But basically, the limiter is the essential processor to put at the end of a mastering chain, just to ensure that we are getting the maximum loudness out of our master, which, whether you're a fan of the loudness wars or not, is an essential part of the mastering chain. So I am using the Pro-L2 by FabFilter. This is my favorite limiting plugin. And I should mention that the Saturn 2 here is also a FabFilter plugin. This is my go-to saturation plugin. After that, I have a simple gain plugin. You can use whatever utility plugin you prefer. And this is just to toggle between having a stereo output and a mono output. So I have this turned on to mono. Whenever I turn this plugin on and off, when it's on, I have a mono output. When it's off, I have the regular stereo output for the master. And then the final piece of the chain, I have the Ulean Loudness Meter 2. There is a free version of this. I'm using the Pro version, but this is just to give me some nice information about the actual LUFS, the short-term integrated, true peak, all of that good stuff. Just a nice metering plugin. especially when it comes to getting loudness. If we are mastering and then sending our masters out to streaming services, which will convert our files into MP3s, we want a true peak max of about -1 dB so that the conversion doesn't actually distort our audio. And so that is something to keep in mind if you are mastering for those systems. Now, some streaming services do suggest that they lower their integrated LUFS to -14. However, I always like to push it louder, as if I'm mastering more so for a CD and get a much louder mix. I think it still translates a lot better, even though there will be fewer dynamics and they will technically turn it down. It does, to my ears, often sound louder if we get a professional loud master versus a master that is mastered at -14 LUFS. We could have a deeper discussion on that, but for this video, I don't necessarily want to get into the details of files and conversions and metadata and tags and all of that. I mostly just want to go through the process of mastering the audio itself within a digital audio workstation. So I really like the Uline loudness meter right here as a metering plugin after everything. It doesn't really color the audio. Of course, when I bounce it out, I'm going to turn this off, but it's just a great plugin for metering. So that is the chain basically. And now let's actually get into mastering. So I'm going to keep this in the bottom corner right here. Let's exit out of everything but the Ozone 10. And let's just have a listen through the track once to get a sense of what the final mix sounds like. You'll notice I have a ton of headroom on the mix right here, even when it's in full bloom, coming right up. All right, so the song is short and sweet, and you can see here that we have 8 dB of headroom to play with on the mix. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 8 dB of headroom. We can work with 3 dB of headroom. Other mastering engineers are like 6 dB. So long as we aren't maxing out in the mix, and we can actually zoom in here on the waveform and see that we aren't clipping or anything right here. We have nice, solid dynamics in our signals, in our mix. And so we are in good standing getting into the mastering process. So the first thing I like to do is just add some sweetening with the Ozone 10. So let's turn this on and we can start with the imager. So what I'm going to do is loop a heavier section of the song. So let's have a quick listen here and work through it like this. So let's start with the imager. And what I like to do oftentimes when I'm mastering is to give a sort of inverted pyramid. So keeping the low end relatively mono or very mono in this case, just as a starting point, and then to widen out the upper range and sort of make it a little bit like that. But let's listen very carefully here and get the imaging set up. So that's too wide. That's too mono. A/B test. It's always very important to A/B test between what we are processing on the master and what we had previously, just to get a better sense of whether we are improving the mix or the master, or whether we are acting detrimentally to the master. So in this case, I think that this is a great starting point. I'm going to run through all of these processes a lot quicker than if I was actually mastering the track. In the sake of time, I don't want this to be too long. But as I say that, it's also important to move quickly and not allow our ears to adjust too quickly to what it is we are hearing and to lose our objectivity in the mastering process. So that is imaging right there. Let's have another quick listen and I'll A/B it a few times. So it's subtle, but it just helps bring out a few of the elements, add a little bit of separation, solidify that low end in the middle image. And we can, in Ozone 10, alter the crossover points here. So we can make more of it mono, like all the way up to 500 if we wanted to. That's 2 mono. Maybe at 193. And you see our vector scope down here and our phase correlation. So +1 is absolutely mono. 0 is about the maximum width we can get without having too much phase cancellation. And then -1 is having the left and right completely out of phase. So we're dropping a little bit below 0 right there. So technically speaking, I might want to actually narrow the image a little bit. And the mix is wide by itself, so we're just looking to sweeten it up. A/B. All right, so we aren't dropping too far below 0. Okay, let's move on to this second module I like in Ozone 10, the Impact. And this is essentially a multi-band expander, which has 4 different bands right here. We see that we have our frequency graph right here, and then we have our controls down here for each of these bands. And so the transient information in each of these bands can actually be enhanced with this Impact module. So let's have a listen, and I will tweak things around, A/B test, and see what we can do with this master. You can see down here that we are pushing the low end a little bit. So that's obviously too much. You can really hear it in the kick. A/B test. So I don't think I actually want the kick to stand out anymore. This upper range helps those synths, the percussive nature of the synths, stand out a little bit more. So that's something I want. So very subtle there, but I think that that is a good point to leave on the Impact. The master rebalance is something that I don't usually use. Sometimes I'll use this if a mix is given to me and I think that the mix itself is a little bit off. It's something that I will also use on my own material just to get a sense of if I need to go back and revisit the mix. But essentially the master rebalance, we can bring up the vocals Ozone 10 does a relatively good job of knowing what the vocals are, what the bass is, or what the drums are. And what we can do is tell Ozone 10 to bring up just the drums or bring down just the drums. Of course, this is all best done in the mix itself, where you have a lot more control over individual tracks and subgroups, but it is an option that I leave in Ozone 10 if I need it. Before moving on, I should mention that Ozone 10 has a bunch of different options for effects processes. So we have a dynamic EQ if we need it, a dynamics processor. This is like a compressor. You see we have parallel compression. We have multiple bands here if we want, I think up to 4. Yeah, 4 different bands. Oftentimes, if I feel like there isn't mix bus compression on a mix that I'm given to master, I will actually bring the dynamics to the beginning to sort of act on the entirety of the mix before bringing it in. In the case of this mix that I did myself, I do have a mix bus compressor on the mix, and so I don't feel the need typically to add any dynamics right here. Additionally, we have equalizers. We have an exciter, which is effectively a saturator, a multi-band saturator here. Again, I believe there are 4 bands. Yes. And each band we can choose triode, analog, retro, a bunch of different options for a bit of saturation. I have the Saturn 2, which is my preferred saturator, in line after the Ozone 2, so I don't typically use the exciter. We also have match EQ if we want to match the EQ to another track. I don't personally ever use this or suggest using match EQ, although it can be useful to kind of get an idea of where you want to go with your EQ. But again, anything that you're doing to try to match somebody else's mix is best done in the mix itself. We have a maximizer, which is essentially a limiter. Again, I have the Pro-L2 right here. We have spectral shaper and some vintage stuff down here as well. So Ozone 10 really is an all-in-one mastering plugin, although I personally like using other plugins in addition to the Ozone 10 right here. So I just wanted to point that out. And now we can move on to the next one right here, which is the stabilizer, which is sort of a dynamic EQ in and of itself. There are a few different options we have right here, and it will basically pull from a pool of data of a bunch of different masters in country, EDM, folk, what have you, and act to dynamically alter the frequencies of the mix to sort of match the mean or the average of the tracks that it is referencing. So in the case of this mix, I may want to go all purpose or pop. Let's hear what pop has right here. And we can choose to shape, which will boost and cut, or we can choose to just cut. We have the amount and we have 3 bands to work with right here. So again, this is a sort of dynamic EQ that is pulling from a variety of different songs that Ozone 10 has analyzed in its data set. So we can have a look at what this does to the mix and the master and decide whether we want to use it or not. So you see it's just cutting right now. I can use it to shape. So it thinks that my mix, compared to a lot of pop masters, is a bit lacking in the low end and the high end, and maybe a bit too much in the mid-range right here. And I can adjust the amount. So that's way too much low end in my opinion. AB. Way too much top end sizzle. I don't like what it's doing to the low end necessarily. So I can bring down this amount. I do like the extra shimmer it's giving. Off. Just helps to brighten things up a little bit and to open up the mid-range, and it's doing so dynamically. You see the EQ curve here kind of dancing around. So I think that in the sake of time, I won't spend too much on this particular setting right here, but I think that it is helping the master out a little bit. And then we have low end focus right here, which I'm not going to use. It just helps to smooth out or add more punch to the low end. I think that the mix does a good job of that by itself. And then we are to the exciter right here. So let's leave the Ozone 10 on. I just wanted to point out what I would personally use in a master like this. And before we get to the standard clip and what that can do for us, let's have a quick listen to the intro, which doesn't have nearly as much dynamics, and I will toggle the Ozone 10 on and off here. so it's going to be a bit glitchy. This helps bring out the intro as well, so I think it's an overall positive what we have going on here. Might take a little bit of refining, but I think we're in good hands. So even though it's a little bit glitchy, we don't get a very clean A/B test right here. I do find that when I turn the Ozone 10 off, the mix itself just sounds relatively dull. And I'm not doing a whole lot in terms of EQ, particularly on the high end. And I'm really not adding too much impact or imaging. It's just, it helps to bring out some of that clarity in the mix. And so I think that we are, again, in good hands with this Ozone 10 in this mastering process. So with that, let's now move on to the second plugin I have in my chain. This is the StandardCLIP. Now, clipping is often demonized in mixing, music production, mastering, but it is a great way of adding potential loudness without overly affecting the transients of a mix. So if we are relying solely on limiting to get that loudness, anytime there is a peak transient, the limiter will react in time to reduce the peak. However, when we are using clipping, we're basically just shaving off the waveform, so we don't have that time variable like we do in limiting, which will often soften the transients. We can actually enhance the transients by shaving off the top by adding a little bit of that distortion. So I don't always use clipping, but let's have a look and listen to what it can do for us in the case of this mastering session. So you see, I'm just clipping off a little bit. It's not like I'm overdoing it, which would sound like this. Lots of distortion. Oftentimes we want to get to a point where it's imperceptible, the distortion. A/B. So there is some distortion there that I can hear. And you see here that this very first peak that stands out, I'm clipping that off so that it is the same peak level as these other ones right here, which are lower. And if we listen back, it really doesn't sound like we are distorting. That versus it off. And so you can see after the Ozone 10 with StandardCLIP turned off, we have a peak at -7.5. And when we turn this on, reset that, we have a peak at -11. So we are saving a significant amount of headroom without having too much of an effect on the overall distortion of the master. So this will help when it comes to limiting and maximizing the volume in the master. Again, just going through this quickly, but I would quickly dial this in when I am mastering as a way to get more headroom and to enhance the potential for loudness. Now let's move on to Saturn 2. This is essentially a exciter that we saw in Ozone 10. It's a saturation plugin. We can also get multi-band saturation here, but typically I like using single band. And saturation is effectively a soft form of distortion that adds harmonic generation to a signal based on the harmonics that are already in the signal. And it also has a slight compression effect to help glue things together and make things more harmonious, while also potentially helping with loudness. So let's have a listen with and without. I'm not sure I'll actually use saturation in this master, but we can have a listen. Just a slight amount. Off. Bring the output gain down so that we are more fair in our A/B testing. On. So it helps the kick stand out a little bit. But personally, I like the separation that we got in the mix without saturation on the master. And so I think I will go without it right now. But again, we can always return to this if we take this master out of the digital audio workstation into a few different playback systems and we find that there's a bit too much separation, we can always come back and help glue things together with a bit of saturation here. Let's move on now to arguably the most important part of mastering, and limiting is something I will always put on the end of my mix bus chain when I am bouncing out from a mix, just so that when I do reference it against other mixes, my references outside the studio, I'm not having such a level disparity. And limiting is effectively hard compression, so we will add gain to the signal, and once the output of that signal reaches a certain point, in this case it is negative 0.197, I believe, then the limiter will not allow the output to surpass that. So it's going to bring down the level as we try to push the level above that negative 0.197. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. There will be some level that goes above that, and that's why we are not just setting it at the absolute ceiling of 0 dBFS. We're going to give ourselves a little bit of leeway just in case anything comes up over this 0.197. And so we will turn this on. I'll bring down the gain from 0 and we will push it up. The look ahead control I have very short. This is basically a knob to set up how quickly the limiter will respond to the peaks in the audio. We have a relatively short attack time, a very short release time. Channel linking is turned all the way off and the style is all around. You can see here that the negative 14 is for streaming right here. I like to set a target of -9 personally when I'm mastering. Even if, again, I'm sending this to streaming services, this is a conversation we can have at another time. I have oversampling at 16x, true peak limiting, dither off. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like. And I will push things up perhaps a little bit too far. We can hear what over limiting can do to the dynamics and the overall quality of the master. And then I will bring it down to a point where I think that we are maximizing the loudness without having too much of a detrimental effect on the end result. So I'm not going to A/B this, because as I add gain, if I was to turn this off, then we would lose that gain. So when I go through and edit this video, I'm actually going to turn this part down so you don't have to turn down your headphones and I won't blow your ears off. So actually, one more thing before we get started, I'm going to turn the oversampling down to 4 just because I have my voice going on right here and I don't want to overload my system. I'm still using a 2015 Mac, believe it or not. And now let's get started here. And I'll use my Yulin loudness meter right here. So let's push this into distortion to hear what over-limiting can sound like. So we got it loud there, but at the expense of really killing the dynamics. Let's bring this down, and I think we might be able to get away with even 4 dB, maybe just 3 dB of gain reduction right here. And I may actually want to go in and reduce the low end because the low end energy will often trigger a limiter because it has more energy to be heard at the same level. So I may need to go through and actually EQ out a little bit of that with perhaps a low shelf. But let's have another listen here. This is again to try to get a integrated loudness. Usually I'll aim for between -8 and -9. So there was distortion on that first hit. Let's have another listen here. So I don't think that sounds too bad, but what we can do is actually go to Ozone 10 here. So let's actually add in a bit of EQ to bring down the low end. I apologize if that cut was a little bit weird. My computer is freaking out. Logic just cannot handle all of this processing with my voice going through it as well. So let's have a look here. Rather than adding in another plugin, I will actually go in and just add in a basic equalizer right here. Take this band and maybe cut down a dB at maybe 100 Hertz. Let's see if we can make things louder now. Hopefully this will play back. And so you see now that we are certainly getting a bit more loudness because the low end is not so powerful. It's not taking up so much energy in the mix. However, because we are having all of these issues with the computer and I turned off oversampling, you saw there that the true peak max is actually at 0.4. So we are beyond digital clipping at this point. And so we can try one more time to bring up the oversampling. Let's try 8x. And have another listen here and have a look at the Ulean loudness meter here. Now, if I was just mastering this without my voice by myself, then my computer would probably be able to handle this. I am saving up for a Mac Studio in the future, but let's have a listen and hopefully Logic Pro will not be screaming at me. And there we go. That's about as far as we could get. But you get the point here. One, that technology gets outdated. If you are running an 8-year-old computer like I am, you may have some limitations. And two, that oversampling and just making sure that you are not surpassing the digital ceiling is a very important part when it comes to mastering. And because modern digital audio workstations utilize 32-bit floating point, we won't actually often hear the distortion that comes with surpassing that 0 dBFS, although we will hear it on the output of the Pro-L 2. But what ends up happening is once we bounce out of the digital audio workstation into 24-bit, anything that is above that 0 dBFS threshold will be digitally clipped and will sound significantly worse if we are pushing too far beyond that. And so I wanted, again, to stress the point that our true peak max needs to be absolutely below 0 dBFS if we want a clean master. And if we are mastering in a way where our files will be then converted down to MP3 or other formats, say for streaming, then we would want a true peak max even lower than that, oftentimes a negative 1.0 dBFS value right here. And so that is something to keep in mind as well. So kind of an anticlimactic way to end this video. I apologize. I will do another video once I get the hardware to actually handle it, but I just really wanted to show you guys my mastering chain in this video to give you a better insight into how I go about mastering and to spark some ideas for you in your own mastering. So I hope that you dug it, and let's now hop out of Logic Pro. All right, I hope that this video has proved insightful for you. I know that mastering is often a mysterious part of the music production process, and I hope that I was able to demystify a little bit of it for you. We can make things as complicated or as simple as possible, and remember that we want to spend a lot of time in the mix and get the mix as solid as possible because mastering won't fix a bad mix. If you would like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. It'll take you through my entire workflow to get a mix from scratch to a final mix. So if you're interested, again, the first link in the description box down below. And if you would like to hang out with me here more on the My New Microphone YouTube channel, I would encourage you to check out one of these videos in the top left or right corner, and also hit subscribe so that you don't miss any of my videos coming up. So do all of that, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.